by giving an overview of where we're at, a recap since last year's National Independent Living Campaign Conference in Birmingham, which was a bit smaller than this one, and introduce some of the ideas that we're going to talk about today. The main thing we need from today is to agree our shared demands for the Independent Living Campaign so that we can coordinate around that going forwards. Can everyone see the slides? It might be... Okay, so for those who weren't involved in the initial Save the Independent Living Fund campaign, which this group has grown out of, I'm just going to give a little bit of background. So the campaign to Save the Independent Living Fund, it was never just about the ILF recipients. There was initially some criticism of the campaign that it didn't acknowledge what was happening to people who'd missed out on the ILF. We of course wanted to protect the social care packages of everybody, so there were some people, Kate Green, who was on the front bench then for Labour, who said, why are you fighting so hard when it's only 1,600 people who are affected, but an injury to one is an injury to all. So the Disabled People's Rights Movement and other allies came behind protecting those packages for the 1,600, but it was also about using the ILF strategically. It was an important campaign that enabled us to highlight the wider and much more complex picture of what was going wrong in social care. We did actually send in a complaint to the United Nations on behalf of people who had missed out on the closure of the ILF. That complaint is actually 3 years later still being processed. There's quite a lot of bureaucracy involved in the UN, but we will update whenever we hear back on that. And ultimately, as Brian says, we were unsuccessful in our goal of saving the Independent Living Fund. However, we did have some wins, some positive outcomes that, if we hadn't been fighting for something so important and so big, would have been seen as amazing achievements. So we delayed the closure of the ILF by 3 months through the legal actions. It meant the government had to retake the closure decision and look more seriously at what was happening to the ILF. And the judgments in the High Court, although we did lose the second challenge, the judges did make statements about the serious adverse impact that the closure would have. We raised the profile of independent living for disabled adults and got media coverage that's fairly unprecedented. It used to be the case that the media didn't tend to look at disabled adults. Disabled children fine, disabled adults, we didn't get much coverage. The top picture on the slide there is actually from a Channel 4 feature that was done on the closure of the ILF. The picture below is of Rob Punton and others storming the House of Commons, as the media called it. We also lobbied. As Brian said, there were many strands to the campaign, so direct action, legal challenges, also lobbying. And although we were unsuccessful in getting the Care Act, the wording of that law, to reference Article 19 of the Convention on the Rights Rights of Disabled People, we did get the statutory guidance to include a reference to Article 19, and that's been useful for lawyers and for legal action going forwards. We also pressed the government into finding an additional 7 billion, nearly 7 billion that they didn't want to, for what they called the former ILF recipient grant. So that's money that they'd allocated for local authorities from 2016 until 2020. Sadly, we know that many local authorities are not spending that money on former ILF recipients because it wasn't ring-fenced. However, I think we still need to acknowledge that to get George Osborne to find that amount of money that he didn't want to was quite an impressive achievement. And the then Minister for Disabled People, Justin Tomlinson, actually told one of our fellow campaigners, John Kelly, that it was because of us pushing them into it that they'd done it. Brian also mentioned the amazing peer support and solidarity that has been created through this campaign, and I know that those of you who are on the email group list are part of that, and the support that you give each other every day I think is absolutely invaluable given what everyone's facing at the moment. And then the campaign's also provided resources for people going through reassessments and put lots of people in contact with solicitors. But we're facing enormous challenges. For those people who have had support to challenge cuts to their packages, what tends to happen is the local authority will then reinstate the package, but that's only pending reassessment. So many of you are stuck in cycles of continuous reassessment and the fear of your packages being cut. We've got some really good solicitors that we're working with, but they're all working beyond capacity because every single disabled adult with a social care package is going through the reality of cuts, and there's not that many of them who can do the work. We've seen the limitations of the judicial review process as a way of challenging cuts to social care packages, most recently through the Davey case. Judicial review looks at the lawfulness of processes, but it's not an adequate way of dealing with whether social care assessments are wrong and the wrong decisions have been made. Judges are very unwilling to go against the professional opinion of social workers. They also don't want to micromanage government policy. The danger when you take strategic litigation and you lose is that it then sets a precedent. And we're seeing quite a scary situation in Hounslow at the moment where they're interpreting the Davey judgment to mean that they don't need to reassess anybody before they take away the ILF portion of their package. We've also disappointingly heard that the Green Paper on social care, which the government promised, which is forthcoming, will focus only on the needs of older disabled people and will exclude working age disabled people. But to be honest, that's not really very surprising. The Green Paper came as a result of the outcry against the Conservative manifesto's dementia tax that they had in their manifesto for the 2017 general election. And really what they're worried about is how to fund social care for older people. They want to make disabled people pay for their own social care. Disabled people of working age are usually, there's a link between disability and poverty, not going to be able to pay for our own care. So it's probably a question they want to avoid. They're also proposing that local authority pays for social care through 100% retention of its business rates, so ending the money that comes down from central government to local government, and that inevitably is going to mean even less money for social care. So the challenges are enormous. The common issues that we're seeing to individuals whose social care packages are being cut, social workers coming in with an agenda whereby they're being forced to cut packages. A recent community care survey showed that 2/3 of social workers who responded to the survey have been told by managers that they need to go in and make cuts to people's packages. We're seeing personal assistants increasingly replaced with technology and equipment, which often doesn't meet the needs of the disabled people. Care managers aren't following the Care Act procedures for reassessments and reviews. People quite often aren't told whether they're having a review or a reassessment, and according to the Care Act, the procedures used for those are different. And increasingly, assessments are being done in very intrusive ways. So very detailed information that people have to give about about the personal assistance that they receive, but also any number of people coming in to watch, sometimes without notice being given, that people are going to turn up at your house and want to watch you receive your personal care. And we've also heard of a case where the care manager wanted to put in some kind of technology that would track exactly what the personal assistant did in the day. Very intrusive into people's personal lives. Many local authorities won't fund nighttime support anymore. We're seeing a misinterpretation of independent living, whereby the idea is that people should be doing things for themselves, whereas we know that independent living is actually about having choice and control over your own life. There's an increasing reliance on unpaid support. People are being told that if they want to do things like participate in the community, they'll need to find a volunteer or a family member or just people that you know, like your neighbours. Increasingly, local authorities in the search for funding are referring people for continuing health care. Often that can be an inappropriate referral, but those assessment procedures are also very intrusive, they're very lengthy, and it adds to the stress on people to go through that, particularly if they're then going to find they're not eligible. People are reporting great difficulty recruiting personal assistants. With the low hourly rates that are paid, that's not surprising, but we're also particularly worried about the impact of Brexit, and many of the personal assistants come from EU nation states, and we're very worried about restrictions on freedom of movement and the impact that will have. There's a lack of infrastructure support for people to manage their direct payments and personal budgets. People are being left having to manage things like changes to employment law, changes through case law on hourly rates for nighttime support, pensions, etc. People are being left without the support to manage those things. And care managers often don't understand. So people will be, for example, told that their hours are going to be cut with only a week's notice, without an understanding that actually people employing their own personal assistants have to abide by the employment contracts that they have with their PAs. And also, as Jenny's going to talk about in her workshop, we're seeing charging policies being introduced by local authorities that are much, much harsher. Although there is some good news on that, in that after a campaign by local people in Enfield, we've just heard that Enfield Council are withdrawing the charging policy that they were planning to introduce, which would have cost disabled people a lot more money. So there is good news.
That's a precedence for the local authorities.
Yeah, yes. Because what we were really worried about was we were seeing this cascade effect across London boroughs, whereby because a few of them had done it, the others were all saying, oh, well, they've done it, so we'll do it. So the fact that we've managed to get that in Enfield, we're hoping, because Redbridge is also consulting, so hopefully we can get a good result in Redbridge as well. So what have we been doing since the last national meeting in July? We've been evidencing the impact that the ILF closure has had. There was the Inclusion London report that came out at the end of last year that we launched in Parliament. Channel 4 worked with us, and they did a round of freedom of information requests similar to the ones we've done in London for a national picture. And the Department for Work and Pensions also published their own evaluation, which showed there had been a serious adverse impact for the closure. It didn't state that. What it stated was it's all a postcode lottery, and they didn't include any statistics. But the qualitative evidence they showed that individuals are definitely facing serious barriers as a result of the closure. One of the ILF campaigners, Claire, who I don't think Claire from Gloucester is with us today, she raised an issue around prepayment cards and people being forced by local authorities to use those when it didn't meet their needs and went against their wishes. Inclusion London worked with Claire, and we got advice from a solicitor, so there is a template letter for anyone who wants to challenge their local authority on forced use of prepayment cards. And also In Control then worked with Claire and the Shaw Trust on a report into prepayment cards and the situation. And basically there are a handful of companies who are making a lot of money by selling those to local authorities. People may know Fleur Perry from Disability United. Fleur looked into the issue of CCGs and their capping policies. She did some freedom of information requests and found there were 44 CCGs with policies that breach the Care Act. The EHRC have now written to those asking those CCGs to respond. I think the responses need to be back about now, and the EHRC have threatened that if those CCGs don't respond to them, they will take legal action. We also did a lot of work this year with the United Nations. At the end of last year, the Disability Committee published their report into the investigation they carried out under the optional protocol. They investigated Article 19, the right to independent living, as well as looking at social security issues, and their conclusion was that welfare reform had caused grave and systematic violations of disabled people's rights. This year, 2017, the UK government was also examined under the Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities. Again, independent living was a major thing that we raised, and in the concluding observations that came out in August, again, the UN were very damning of the situation in the UK. Alongside those concluding observations, they also published, the Disability Committee also published a general comment on Article 19. So a general comment doesn't just apply to the UK, it applies to any country where the UNCRPD is signed up to. But I think they had a lot of things happening in the UK in mind when they wrote it. It's very positive in terms of pressing for an interpretation of independent living that we understand, it being about choice and control. So I think that we've got some copies outside, but I've done copies of the general comment for everyone with just a briefing on the top page of the key points that come out for that. One of the things they said in there, particularly relevant to our current fight, they said that institutionalisation also applies to people when they're in their own homes, when they're trapped and they're isolated and they're segregated. Nathan in Wales, who sends his apologies, who can't be with us, has been campaigning very hard to save the Welsh Independent Living Grant. So the Welsh Assembly has said that when the former ILF recipient grant ends, they will be transferring responsibility to local authorities in Wales. So the same picture as we've got in England, and of course we've seen how badly that's gone here. He's trying very hard to put pressure on the Welsh Assembly to reverse that decision and to follow the example of Scotland in setting up a new Welsh Independent Living Fund. The Welsh Assembly are very against it, so he's been fighting an uphill battle. However, he has had support. In the picture on the slide, that is Ken Loach holding one of Nathan's campaign postcards that Brian had designed. And if anyone can offer any help to Nathan, then please do get in contact. We can share his contact details. In particular, I think he really needs to be in contact with more people who received the Welsh Independent Living Grant. There aren't many in his area, so he is getting a lot of support from allies, but we really need some more ILF recipients in Wales involved in that campaign. We also held, a couple of weeks ago, a National Disabled People's Summit, and there was a workshop on independent living there, and Mark will say a bit more about what came out of that when he speaks. So what are our opportunities going forwards? So although the Green Paper isn't going to include disabled adults of working age, the government has said there will be a work stream that looks at working age disabled adults, and Inclusion London and Reclaiming Our Futures is going to submit our thoughts to the Cabinet Office on what that work stream needs to include. We also think we need to start trying to influence Labour Party policy. They've given a commitment to enshrine the UNCRPD into domestic legislation if they were elected. They also made a commitment in their manifesto to set up a national care system. They haven't given many details on what that would look like, and what we think we need to do is to agree what our vision would be, and Mark's going to say more on that, so we can start lobbying for that. The Equality and Human Rights Commission have just instructed a barrister to explore different options to legislate for a right to independent living. The Care Act, as we know, is not working in protecting the right to independent living for disabled people. What would it look like if we had a law, or could we change the Equality Act, for example? There are different options to be explored about how we put that into legislation. And then the funding for today has come from research projects that DPAC's got funding for to explore alternative models of independent living. And Steve Graby, who is here, who is doing a PhD on independent living, is going to lead that workshop, so we can look at cooperative models from abroad and see what characteristics of those would be useful for independent living over here. This is a suggestion of some of the priorities we might want to agree for next year, and this is really what we want to hear from you all this afternoon. We obviously need to continue to monitor and evidence what's happening, what the impact of the closure of the ILF has been, what's happening in social care. We need to continue to provide support for individuals, so that peer support networks, but also putting people in contact with solicitors to challenge when their packages are being unfairly cut. We do want to look at strategic litigation. We had Davy, but in the main, the activity with solicitors has been fighting against cuts on an individual basis. We can't fight for every single individual package. There isn't the time or capacity. If we could escalate to take a case that would set a positive precedent, that would be helpful. We need to set out our vision for an independent living support system that we want to see. And the other thing that's been raised, and I have also copied, sorry there are so many bits of paper, briefing that Simone Askers did. She sends apologies, she can't be here today. But Simone feels very strongly that we need to fight institutionalisation. What we're seeing is a return to institutionalisation, not just in terms of people being trapped in their own homes, but also in terms of a rise in care settings. Southampton Council, for example, whilst cutting people's packages, invested several million in a new super care home. Extra housing is being used in a way of resegregating people. So those are just some thoughts. To finish, before we move on to Mark, I'm just going to show a film just to remind ourselves of how powerful we can be and what we can do when we put our minds to it.
A number of disability protesters who are protesting about the Independent Living Fund. About 10 minutes ago, they rushed towards the members' lobby there where the Commons chamber is, in an effort, it seems, to get into the chamber in the middle of Prime Minister's questions. Now, the police, about 30 or 40 police, closed the door, stopped them from getting in, and they weren't able to get into central lobby, and Prime Minister's questions carried on, seemingly, I think, oblivious to what has been going on here. But I have to say, I've never seen scenes like this before, with protesters chanting, shouting, just yards from the Commons chamber. They started off perfectly peacefully. I was talking to some of them before Prime Minister's questions got underway. They were giving out leaflets. They were hoping to see some MPs. And then, as I say, whether it was prepared in advance, I don't know. But suddenly there was a concerted rush towards the members' lobby as they tried to catch the police off guard. And initially, it seemed almost as if they'd got through before the doorman managed to close the huge doors to the central lobby before they could actually get through. But you can see the demonstration is still going on here as police try to lift them out and clear them away. And this is what they're protesting about, the Independent Living Fund. And all this, of course, before we know of further possible cuts to some disability benefits here inside Central Lobby because of their anger. I'm sorry?
You have to stop. You can't film with this going on in the
You're
background.
not allowed to film this. Why not?
Because it's part of the rules and conditions of you using this area. That
Also,
you